This story was sent to me by Marcus Chen via email, and honestly, it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was 12 years old, crouched behind my neighbor's garbage bins at 2 in the morning, watching a man in a blue hoodie standing perfectly still in my backyard. He'd been there for over an hour, just staring at my bedroom window. But let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. It was summer 2019, and I was completely obsessed with Sonic the Hedgehog. I had posters covering every inch of my bedroom walls, action figures lined up on my shelves, and I spent hours every day on Sonic fan forums sharing theories and artwork. My username was SonicSpeed2007, and I thought I was part of this amazing community of fans who shared my passion. That's where I met Blue Blur 94. He seemed like the coolest older fan. He knew everything about rare Sonic merchandise, had original game cartridges I'd never seen, and always complimented my fan art posts. When he suggested we should meet up at the local comic convention to trade some rare Sonic items, I was thrilled. My parents said no, of course, but Blue Blur 94 said he understood and that maybe he could just drop some things off at my house instead. I gave him my address without thinking twice. Looking back, every adult in my life had warned me about online strangers, but he felt so safe, so normal. We talked about Sonic every day for months. He knew my school schedule, my favorite games, even when my parents worked late. I thought he was just being a good friend. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening. I was in my room playing Sonic Adventure 2 when my mom called me for dinner. As I paused the game, I noticed someone had been watching me through my window. The curtains were slightly parted, and I could see the impression where someone had been standing pressed against the glass. The screen was smudged with what looked like breath marks, as if someone had been there for a long time. When I told my parents, they checked the backyard but found nothing. They installed motion sensor lights and told me to keep my curtains closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. During online conversations, Blue Blur 94 started mentioning things he couldn't possibly know, like how I'd rearranged my Sonic figures that day, or that I'd worn my favorite Sonic t-shirt to school. The situation escalated quickly after that. He started messaging me at odd hours, asking if I was alone, if my parents were home, if I wanted to come outside and see the special Sonic collection he'd brought for me. His messages became more persistent, more demanding. When I stopped responding, he'd send dozens of messages in a row, getting angry, then apologetic, then threatening. The night I ended up hiding behind the garbage bins was when everything came to a head. I'd blocked Blue Blur 94 on all platforms after he'd sent me a photo of my own house taken from across the street. My parents had contacted the police, but they said without physical evidence or direct threats, there wasn't much they could do yet. I couldn't sleep that night. Something felt wrong, like the air itself was charged with danger. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on my window. Not random tree branches or settling house sounds, a deliberate, rhythmic tapping, like someone trying to get my attention. I crept to my window and carefully moved the curtain just enough to peek out. There he was, a tall man in a blue hoodie, standing motionless in our backyard, staring directly at my window. Even in the dim light from our neighbor's porch, I could see he was holding something, a stuffed Sonic toy that he kept raising and lowering like he was making it wave at me. I knew I should wake my parents, but I was frozen with terror. This person had been coming to my house, watching me, learning my routines. How long had this been going on? How many nights had he been out there while I slept, completely unaware? That's when I made the stupidest decision of my life. Instead of getting help, I decided to sneak outside and get proof. I thought if I could take a photo or video, the police would have to take this seriously. I quietly slipped out through our back door, planning to circle around through our neighbor's yard to get a clear shot with my phone. But as soon as I stepped outside, I realized how vulnerable I was. The man wasn't just standing there anymore. He was moving, walking slowly around our house like he was patrolling it. When I crouched behind the garbage bins, I could hear him humming something under his breath. It took me a moment to recognize the tune. It was the Green Hill Zone theme from the first Sonic game. For the next hour, I watched him circle our house over and over, occasionally stopping to peer into windows or test door handles. He knew exactly which windows were mine, which rooms my parents slept in, where our spare key was hidden. This wasn't random. He'd been studying our house, our family, our routines for months. The most terrifying moment came when he walked directly toward where I was hiding. I held my breath as his footsteps approached, getting closer and closer, until I could see his shoes just inches from me through the gap between the bins. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and I could hear him breathing heavily above me. Then my phone buzzed and my heart nearly stopped. The sound was quiet, but in the dead silence of the night, it might as well have been a fire alarm. I saw his feet shift, and I knew he'd heard it too. I was certain he was about to discover me crouched there, completely defenseless and alone. But instead, he walked away. I heard his footsteps retreating toward the street, and after another agonizing 20 minutes of waiting, I finally crept back inside and woke my parents. The police took it seriously this time, especially when we found evidence that someone had been tampering with our doors and windows. They increased patrols in our neighborhood and helped us file for a restraining order, even though we didn't know Blue Blur 94's real identity yet. We never saw him again after that night, but the investigation revealed that he'd been targeting several young Sonic fans in our area, using the same methods to gain their trust and learn about their lives. Apparently, I wasn't his first victim, just the one who got lucky enough to avoid becoming something worse than a target. I still love Sonic games, but I learned a harsh lesson about online safety that summer. The person I thought was a friend had spent months grooming me, learning my vulnerabilities, and planning something I don't even want to imagine. I found this story on a Reddit thread by user RetroGamer88, and it perfectly captures why you should always trust your instincts, even when everyone else thinks you're overreacting. The smell hit me first, a mixture of mold, stale cigarettes, and something else I couldn't identify but made my stomach turn. I was standing in the doorway of what was supposed to be a retro gaming paradise, but something about this place felt deeply wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. This happened during my senior year of college when I was completely broke, but desperate to find a copy of Sonic 3 and Knuckles for my birthday. I'd been searching online marketplaces for weeks, and everything was either overpriced or obviously fake. That's when I found a listing on Craigslist that seemed too good to be true. A complete collection of original Sonic games for the Genesis, all in excellent condition, being sold for a fraction of their market value. The seller, who went by the name Dave, said he was moving across the country and needed to get rid of his collection quickly. He seemed legitimate enough in our email exchanges, knew all the right details about the games, and even sent photos that looked authentic. When I asked to meet at a public place, he insisted I come to his house because the games were fragile and he didn't want to transport them unnecessarily. I should have walked away right then, but I was young and stupid and desperately wanted those games. Dave lived about an hour outside the city, in a rural area I'd never been to before. The house was isolated, surrounded by overgrown fields and broken-down farm equipment, with the nearest neighbor probably a mile away. When Dave answered the door, my first instinct was to leave immediately. He was probably in his 50s, pale and thin with greasy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His smile was too wide, too eager, and his eyes kept darting around like he was checking to make sure I was alone. But then he started talking about the games with genuine enthusiasm, sharing stories about hunting down rare cartridges and the golden age of 16-bit gaming. He seemed to know everything about Sonic's development history, the different regional releases, even obscure facts about the sound programming. Despite my unease, I found myself getting drawn into the conversation. He led me through his house toward what he called his game room, and that's when I noticed how wrong everything felt. The house was cluttered with random junk, old newspapers stacked to the ceiling, and boxes labeled with things like kitchen stuff and bedroom items, as if he'd been packing to move for years but never actually left. The game room was in the basement, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. As we walked down the wooden stairs, I noticed there were multiple locks on the door we'd just come through. Not just a regular doorknob lock, but deadbolts and chain locks, all installed on the basement side. Why would someone need to lock themselves into a basement? The room itself was like stepping into a time capsule from 1995. CRT televisions lined the walls, each connected to different vintage consoles. Shelves were packed with games, some still in their original packaging, others carefully organized by system and release date. Under different circumstances, it would have been amazing. But Dave's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. He kept positioning himself between me and the stairs, and I noticed he'd quietly close the basement door behind us when we came down. When I commented on his impressive collection, he started talking about how he'd been acquiring games for decades, sometimes through methods that weren't exactly conventional. He showed me the Sonic games, and they were exactly as advertised. Perfect condition, complete with boxes and manuals. But as I examined them, I started noticing other things around the room that made my skin crawl. There were notebooks filled with handwritten lists of names, addresses, and what looked like schedules. On one of the TV screens, I could see what appeared to be security camera feeds showing different angles of the property outside. When I asked to buy just the Sonic games instead of the whole collection, Dave's demeanor shifted completely. He became agitated, insisting that I had to take everything or nothing, that breaking up the collection would ruin everything he'd worked for. His voice got louder, more desperate, and he started pacing around the room like a caged animal. That's when I noticed the other door in the basement, a heavy wooden door with multiple locks, just like the one we'd come through. When I asked what was behind it, Dave's face went completely blank for a moment before he smiled that too wide smile again and said it was just storage. But I could hear something from behind that door. Not voices exactly, but sounds that suggested the space beyond wasn't empty. Dave must have seen the realization dawning on my face because his whole demeanor changed again, becoming cold and calculating. He told me I couldn't leave until we completed our transaction, that he'd gone through too much trouble arranging this meeting to let me walk away empty-handed. When I said I'd changed my mind and wanted to go, he casually mentioned that he'd disabled my car while I was looking at the games, something about disconnecting the battery so I wouldn't be tempted to leave prematurely. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. Dave continued showing me games and talking about prices like we were having a normal transaction, but his eyes never left me, and he kept maneuvering to block my access to the stairs. I realized I was trapped in a basement with someone who was clearly unstable, miles from help, with no way to communicate with the outside world. I knew I had to get out of there, but Dave was bigger than me and obviously knew the house better than I did. My only advantage was that he still seemed to think he could convince me to go along with whatever he had planned. I played along, pretending to be interested in more of his collection while desperately trying to figure out an escape plan. My opportunity came when Dave went to the far side of the room to show me some rare Japanese imports. I told him I needed to use the bathroom and asked if I could go upstairs. He hesitated for a long moment, then said I could use the one down there and pointed to another door I hadn't noticed. Instead of going to the bathroom, I quietly moved toward the stairs. The basement door was still unlocked, and I could hear Dave rummaging through games on the other side of the room. I knew I'd only have seconds before he realized what I was doing. I made it halfway up the stairs before I heard him shout behind me. I ran through the house as fast as I could, not stopping to look back, and burst through the front door. My car was parked right where I'd left it, and thankfully, Dave had been lying about disabling it. The engine started immediately. As I drove away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, standing in his doorway watching me leave. He wasn't running after me or acting panicked like someone who'd lost a sale. He looked calm, calculating, like he was already planning his next move. I called the police as soon as I got back to town, but when they went to check on the house the next day, Dave was gone. The house was completely empty. No games, no furniture, no sign that anyone had been living there recently. The neighbors said the place had been abandoned for months, and no one matching Dave's description had been seen in the area. I never found out who Dave really was or what he'd been planning, but I'm certain that if I hadn't trusted my instincts and gotten out of there when I did, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. The police said there had been other reports of suspicious Craigslist sellers in the area, and several people had gone missing after responding to too good to be true gaming deals. I eventually found my Sonic games through legitimate channels, but I'll never forget that basement or the feeling of being trapped with someone whose intentions were clearly far worse than just selling video games. Sometimes the best deals come with the highest prices, and no game collection is worth risking your safety. This was shared with me on Instagram by Sarah Martinez, and it's a perfect reminder that sometimes the people who seem most harmless can be the most dangerous. I was 14, hiding in a McDonald's bathroom stall at midnight, texting my mom to come pick me up while I could hear someone pacing outside the door asking employees if they'd seen his little sister. The problem was, I didn't have a big brother, and the man looking for me was someone I'd met only 3 hours earlier. But let me start from the beginning. I was at the biggest gaming convention our city had ever hosted, completely in my element, surrounded by thousands of people who shared my obsession with video games. My parents had finally agreed to let me go alone for the first time, trusting that I was mature enough to handle myself in what seemed like a safe, supervised environment. I'd spent most of the day hunting for Sonic merchandise and meeting other fans. The convention was incredible. Multiple floors of vendors, gaming tournaments, cosplay contests, and panels with industry developers. I felt like I belonged there in a way I never did at school, surrounded by people who understood why I got so excited about frame rates and sprite animations. Late in the afternoon, I was browsing a vendor's table full of rare Sonic collectibles when this friendly guy started a conversation with me about the games. He introduced himself as Tom and said he worked for one of the gaming companies that had a booth at the convention. He seemed to know everything about Sonic's development history, had insider stories about the game's creation, and even showed me his convention staff badge. Tom was probably in his 30s, dressed professionally in khakis and a polo shirt with a company logo. He looked completely normal, the kind of person you'd see working at any office or retail store. When he offered to give me a behind-the-scenes tour of their booth and maybe even introduce me to some of the developers, I was thrilled. Over the next couple of hours, Tom was the perfect convention companion. He helped me find rare items I'd been searching for, introduced me to other collectors, and seemed genuinely interested in sharing his knowledge about the gaming industry. He bought me lunch and listened patiently while I rambled about my favorite Sonic levels and theories about future games. As the day progressed, Tom started asking more personal questions: where I lived, what school I attended, whether my parents were picking me up or if I was driving myself. I answered without thinking much about it, still caught up in the excitement of meeting someone who worked in the gaming industry and who seemed to take my interests seriously. The convention was scheduled to end at 8 p.m., but Com suggested we grab dinner afterward so he could tell me more about career opportunities in game development. He said he knew a great place nearby that was popular with convention attendees and that he'd drive me back to meet my parents afterward. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I missed. Tom never actually showed me his booth or introduced me to any colleagues. When other people approached us throughout the day, he'd quickly steer our conversation away or suggest we move to a different area. He'd been systematically isolating me from the crowd and gathering information about my situation. But at the time, I felt special and mature. Here was this successful adult who treated me like an equal, who valued my opinions and wanted to help me explore my career interests. When my parents texted asking when to pick me up, Tom encouraged me to tell them I'd find my own way home, since I was practically an adult now. The restaurant Tom took me to wasn't the popular convention hangout he described. It was a rundown diner in an industrial part of town, nearly empty except for a few truckers and night shift workers. Tom's whole demeanor changed once we left the convention center. He became more controlling, insisting I sit in a specific booth with my back to the wall, ordering for me without asking what I wanted. During dinner, Tom's questions became more invasive and inappropriate. He wanted to know about my family's schedule, whether I had siblings, if I was dating anyone. When I started feeling uncomfortable and said I wanted to call my parents, he convinced me to wait, saying he had something special to show me first, some rare Sonic prototype cartridges in his car. The parking lot behind the diner was dark and isolated, far from the streetlights and late-night traffic. Tom's car was parked at the very back, away from any other vehicles. As we walked toward it, I started feeling genuinely scared for the first time all day. Something about the situation felt predatory, like I was being led into a trap. When Tom opened his car trunk, there weren't game cartridges inside. Instead, I saw rope, duct tape, and other items that made my blood run cold. Tom's friendly facade dropped completely, and he told me to get in the car quietly if I didn't want anyone to get hurt. That's when my fight or flight response finally kicked in. Instead of complying, I screamed as loud as I could and ran toward the diner. Tom chased after me, shouting that I was his little sister and that I was having some kind of episode, that he just needed to get me home safely. I made it inside the diner and immediately started telling anyone who would listen that the man chasing me was not my brother and that I needed help. Tom followed me inside, still maintaining his act, telling the staff and other customers that I was his troubled little sister who sometimes had panic attacks and made up stories. It was terrifying how convincing he was. He had details about me that only a real family member would know. My name, my age, what school I attended, even what my parents looked like from photos I'd showed him earlier. Some of the people in the diner actually seemed to believe him, especially when he showed him his professional-looking ID badge from the convention. But one of the waitresses wasn't buying it. Maybe she'd seen this kind of situation before, or maybe her instincts were just better than everyone else's. She quietly called the police while Tom was trying to convince the manager that he just needed to get me to his car so he could take me home. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my parents while Tom continued his performance in the dining area. I could hear him talking to other customers, describing my supposed mental health issues and explaining how worried my family was about me. He was so convincing that I almost started doubting myself. When the police arrived, Tom's story began to fall apart quickly. He couldn't provide any real identification beyond his convention badge, couldn't give them my parents' contact information, and became increasingly agitated when they asked for proof of our relationship. The real breakthrough came when they searched his car. In addition to the disturbing items in his trunk, they found notebooks full of information about other young convention attendees, names, photos, personal details, and what appeared to be plans for future meetings. I wasn't his first target, just his most recent one. It turned out that Tom had been using gaming conventions as hunting grounds for months, possibly years. He'd perfected a system of identifying isolated young attendees, building trust over several hours, and then creating opportunities to get them alone. The company badge he'd shown me was fake, and he'd never worked for any gaming company at all. My parents arrived at the police station around 2 a.m., and I've never been so relieved to see anyone in my life. The officer who interviewed me said I was incredibly lucky. Most of Tom's previous victims hadn't been as quick to recognize danger or as willing to cause a scene when things went wrong. I still go to gaming conventions, but I'm much more cautious now about trusting strangers, no matter how knowledgeable or professional they seem. I've learned that predators often target specific communities and events where they can blend in and exploit people's shared interests to build false trust. The scariest part is how normal Tom seemed, how easily he fit into the convention environment, and how close I came to getting into that car with him. If that waitress hadn't trusted her instincts and called for help, or if I'd been just a little more trusting and compliant, I might never have made it home that night. Tom was eventually convicted on multiple charges related to attempted kidnapping and stalking, but I know there are others like him out there, using our shared hobbies and communities as cover for their real intentions. The gaming community is mostly full of wonderful, genuine people, but it's important to remember that predators know that too, and they use our trust and enthusiasm against us.